April 16th, 1947, 10:08 in the morning, Auschwitz, Poland. A man in his late 40s walked briskly across the courtyard of the former concentration camp, so briskly that the armed guards escorting him had to keep pace. Witnesses who were there that morning later said they had never seen anything like it. A man walking to his own execution, setting the pace, not being dragged, not stumbling, not weeping. Walking quickly, almost eagerly, as if he had somewhere to be and did not want to be late. He had been here before, of course. He had run this place for years. He knew every corner of it. He had designed the systems that killed over 1 million people within its walls. And now the gallows that had been built specifically for him stood in the courtyard next to the crematorium, next to the building that had processed the bodies of the people his systems had murdered. He walked toward it without hesitation. His name was Rudolf Höss. He was the longest-serving commandant of Auschwitz. And the story of how he got to that courtyard and what he wrote in the weeks before he walked across it is one of the most extraordinary documents in the entire history of the Second World War. Rudolf Franz Ferdinand Höss was born on November 25, 1900, in Baden-Baden, Germany, into a devoutly Catholic family. His father was a merchant who had once served in the German colonial forces in Africa. From the beginning, his upbringing was shaped by two forces that would define everything that followed: strict religious discipline and an absolute reverence for military obedience. His father dedicated him, before he was old enough to have any say in the matter, to the Catholic priesthood. Höss was raised to believe that obedience to authority, to God, to the church, to his father, was the highest virtue a human being could possess. And then, at 14 years old, the First World War began, and the authority that mattered most in Germany was no longer the church. It was the army. He ran away to enlist at 15, lying about his age to join the fight. He served in the Middle East, was wounded 3 times, and became, at 17, the youngest non-commissioned officer in the entire German army. When the war ended in 1918, Höss was 18 years old and had no idea what to do with himself. The army had been his entire world. Peace had no use for him. He drifted, joining the Freikorps, the paramilitary groups that fought street battles across post-war Germany, and eventually becoming involved in a political murder that sent him to prison for 6 years. In prison, he read. He thought. He became increasingly drawn to the idea that Germany's problems were racial, that they could be solved through discipline, through order, through the elimination of what the Nazi movement was already describing as the Jewish question. He joined the Nazi Party in 1922. He joined the SS in 1934. He was sent to Dachau, the first concentration camp, to learn the system from the ground up. And then, on May 4, 1940, he was appointed commandant of a new facility being built near the Polish town of Auschwitz. The camp was called Auschwitz. At the time of his appointment, it held a few hundred Polish political prisoners and some basic wooden structures. What Rudolf Höss built it into, over the next 3.5 years, is the reason his name has never been forgotten. What happened at Auschwitz under Höss is, even now, almost impossible to fully comprehend. Not because the facts are unclear, but because the scale defeats the human capacity for understanding. Over 1 million people were murdered at Auschwitz between 1940 and 1945. More than 90% of them were Jewish. They came from across occupied Europe, from Poland, from Hungary, from France, from the Netherlands, from Greece. They arrived on trains, in cattle cars, having been told they were being resettled. They stepped onto the platform. They were divided. The elderly, the very young, the pregnant, anyone deemed unable to work, sent to the left, everyone else to the right. Those sent to the left were told to undress for showers. They were walked into gas chambers, and within minutes they were dead. The gas that killed them was Zyklon B, a pesticide that, on the suggestion of one of Höss's subordinates, he introduced to the camp's killing process because it killed faster and more efficiently than the carbon monoxide methods used elsewhere. Höss later wrote about this moment in his autobiography as if he were describing a factory efficiency improvement, a better method implemented to handle the volume the system required. He called it a relief, not for the people dying in the chambers. For him, because, he wrote, it spared him the emotional burden of the shooting methods that had been used before. If you are hearing that and finding it difficult to process, that is the correct response. A man who murdered over 1 million people was relieved because the method was quieter. Hit the like button if this is the kind of history you want more of. Höss ran Auschwitz until November 1943, when he was transferred to a senior position in the SS concentration camp inspection system, overseeing all camps across occupied Europe. He returned to Auschwitz briefly in 1944, specifically to oversee Operation Höss, the systematic deportation and murder of Hungarian Jews, which brought approximately 430,000 people to Auschwitz in the space of 8 weeks. In 8 weeks, roughly 320,000 of them were murdered in the gas chambers. At its peak, the camp was processing 6,000 people per day. Höss was there to make sure it ran on schedule. When the war ended in 1945, Höss did what so many others did. He disappeared. He obtained false papers under the name Franz Lang and found work as a farm laborer in northern Germany, hiding among the ordinary post-war chaos of a defeated country. For almost a year it worked. Then, in March 1946, British intelligence received a tip. Höss's wife and children had been located. British military police visited his wife and told her that if she did not reveal her husband's location, her son would be sent to Siberia. She gave them the address. On the night of March 11, 1946, a British Army unit surrounded the farm where Höss was sleeping and broke in. He was found hiding in a bed. According to the account of the arresting officer, Site Index equals 3-1. After a series of blows, Höss finally confessed his true identity, whereupon he was nearly beaten to death by a number of Jewish soldiers in the arresting party. He was pulled away from them still alive and placed in custody. He was transferred to Nuremberg, where he gave testimony as a defense witness. Perversely, he had been called to testify in an attempt to show that the SS had followed orders from above, not acted independently. But what Höss actually said on the stand at Nuremberg destroyed that argument entirely. He confirmed everything. He signed a written statement that became one of the most devastating documents in the entire Nuremberg proceedings. Site Index equals 10-1. It read, I personally arranged on orders received from Himmler in May 1941 the gassing of 2 million persons between June-July 1941 and the end of 1943, during which time I was commandant of Auschwitz. 2 million. Signed with his name, his rank, his title. No hesitation, no attempt to minimize. Just the number and a signature. He was extradited to Poland and held at Montelupich prison in Krakow. And here is where his story took the turn that historians have been studying ever since. A Polish prison psychiatrist and a judge assigned to prepare his case, a man named Jan Sen, spent weeks with Höss before his trial, talking to him, studying him, trying to understand him, and they persuaded him to write. Judge Sen and psychiatrist Stanislaw Batawa convinced him to write an autobiography and other books. Over the months before his trial, in a Polish prison cell, Rudolf Höss wrote one of the most extraordinary documents to survive the entire Nazi era, a detailed, calm, systematic account of his entire life, from his childhood in Baden-Baden to the gas chambers of Auschwitz. He wrote about his father's ambitions for him. He wrote about the First World War. He wrote about joining the SS, about being sent to Dachau, about being appointed commandant of Auschwitz. He wrote about the selections, the gas chambers, the crematoria, in the same flat procedural tone he might have used to write a management report. 6th, he confessed to having felt, all during his concentration camp activity, that something was not right. This remained a feeling only. He did not reflect on the matter, but simply obeyed, as he had been trained to do. and something was not right. The man who had signed a statement at Nuremberg confirming he had personally arranged the gassing of 2 million people described his internal experience of doing it as a feeling that something was not right, that he had not reflected on, that he had simply obeyed. The autobiography was later published and remains in print to this day, cited by historians, studied by psychologists, used in classrooms around the world as one of the primary documents for understanding how ordinary human beings become capable of administering industrialized mass murder. Index equals 5:1. His trial began on March 11, 1947. It lasted until April 2nd. Index equals 5:1. 85 witnesses testified. Survivors, former prisoners, people who had stood on the platforms at Auschwitz and watched the selections happen. Index equals 3:1. The most horrifying witness of all proved to be Rudolf Höss himself. Calm, detailed, factual, confirming everything. Index equals 6:1. The court issued a 64-page finding of guilt and condemned him to death. Höss thanked the lawyers who had defended him and declined his right to appeal for clemency. He had been waiting for this verdict since the moment of his arrest. He had expected it. He accepted it without a word of protest. Cite index equals 8:1. On April 7th, during a meeting with the prosecutor, Höss asked to see a priest. On April 10th, he made a Catholic confession of faith and confessed his sins. He had been raised Catholic, in a household where obedience to the church was the highest virtue. He had spent his adult life serving a regime that was the opposite of everything that church taught, and in his final days in a Polish prison cell, he went back. Whether he believed in what he was doing, or whether it was simply the ritual comfort of something familiar before the end, is not recorded. Cite index equals 8:1. On April 16th, 1947, Höss was transported and imprisoned in Block 11 at the former Auschwitz camp. The sentence was carried out at 10:08 in the morning by hanging. The gallows had been built specifically for him. Constructed next to the building of the former Auschwitz headquarters, just steps from the entrance to the gas chamber and the crematorium. Index equals 3:1. Witnesses were surprised that a man facing imminent execution would set such a rapid pace. The 47-year-old Höss had expected to be hanged from the moment he was captured. Being arraigned before a Polish military tribunal was, in his view, a mere formality. He walked to the gallows quickly, almost briskly. He stood above the trap. He was calm, and then he was gone. Index equals 5:1. His body was likely cremated either in Krakow or Wadowice. The location of his ashes remains unknown. The gallows on which he was hanged still stand today, preserved at the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum, visited by over 2 million people per year. The gas chamber beside which he died is also preserved. The railway platform where the selections happened, where he stood or where the guards he commanded stood, pointing left and pointing right, is also preserved. Everything that Rudolf Höss built is still there, and Rudolf Höss is ashes in an unknown location scattered somewhere in southern Poland. Site index equals 9:1. His daughter Brigitte, interviewed decades later, described him as the nicest father in the world, someone who would read stories and take the children on boat rides. There were two sides to him, a journalist noted, the father and the commandant. And that is what makes Rudolf Höss uniquely disturbing, even among the figures this channel covers. He was not a monster who looked like a monster. He was a man who looked like a father. Who reads stories to his children at night in a house on the grounds of the camp where, a few hundred meters away, the chimneys of the crematoria were burning around the clock. Who felt that something was not right? Who did not reflect on it? Who simply obeyed? If you want to hear the story of the man who gave Höss's orders, Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, who died on the floor of a house in Germany, biting through a cyanide capsule before anyone could bring him to a courtroom. That story is already on this channel. Subscribe to Ordinity so you don't miss what comes next.